Adding an electric fence was never part of my plan when I bought my dream house. But when your neighbor starts organizing public picnics on your front lawn and claims your private property is community space, you'd be surprised what lengths you'll go to protect what's yours. This is the story of how I went from being the new guy in town to becoming the guy who electrified his property line, and why I don't regret it one bit. I never thought I'd be the type of person to install an electric fence around my property. Growing up in a small town taught me the value of community and sharing, but it also taught me about respecting boundaries. After 15 years of living in cramped city apartments, I'd finally saved enough to buy my dream home, a beautiful colonial house sitting on 2 acres of land in Riverside Heights, Cedar Grove. The property was everything I'd ever wanted. Mature oak trees dotted the expansive front yard, creating perfect shade spots for reading or relaxing. The backyard stretched out to a small creek, offering the kind of privacy and natural beauty I'd only dreamed about during my years in the city. When I first walked the property with Diana Wright, my real estate agent, she mentioned how rare it was to find such a large lot in this sought-after neighborhood. "You're getting a gem here, Jack," Diana had said, gesturing to the natural stone path leading to the front door. "These older properties with large lots are becoming increasingly scarce in Cedar Grove. People are usually splitting them up or selling portions." I closed on the house in early spring, just as the trees were starting to bud. The previous owners had maintained the property beautifully, with well-established gardens and a natural flow that made the 2 acres feel like a private park. I spent those first few weeks settling in, arranging furniture, and planning where I'd plant my vegetable garden. My neighbors, Bob and Nancy Thompson, an elderly couple who'd lived next door for 30 years, were the first to welcome me to the neighborhood. They brought over a homemade apple pie and shared stories about the area's history. Everything felt perfect, the kind of suburban dream I'd worked so hard to achieve. I even started working from home more often, setting up my laptop on the wide front porch, enjoying the peace and quiet that came with having my own space. The property wasn't fenced in, something I initially loved because it added to the natural, open feeling. The previous owners had used simple decorative posts with chains to mark the property lines, which seemed more than adequate. Everything was going smoothly until Memorial Day weekend, when I first met Patricia Miller, Pat, as she insisted on being called. I was working in my front yard, planning out where to plant some new flowering shrubs, when I noticed a group of people setting up folding tables and chairs on my lawn. At first, I thought they must be confused about the property lines. Surely no one would just set up a gathering on someone's private property without asking. I watched in disbelief as Pat, dressed in a perfectly pressed tennis outfit, directed people where to place their potluck dishes and lawn games. I approached the group, trying to keep my composure. "Excuse me," I said. "I think there might be some confusion. This is private property." Pat turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, you must be the new owner. I'm Pat Miller, head of the Riverside Heights Community Association. We always use this space for our holiday gatherings. It's tradition." I blinked, stunned by her casual assertion. "I'm sorry, but this is my private property. I just bought this house. And while I'm happy to meet my neighbors, you can't just set up events here without asking." Pat's smile tightened. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You must not understand. This front area has always been community space. We've been holding our gatherings here for years. The previous owners understood the importance of sharing with the community." I stood there wondering if I was somehow being pranked. "I have the property deed," I said firmly. "This is private property, not community space. I need you to pack up and leave." Pat's friendly facade dropped instantly. "Listen here," she said, stepping closer. "You clearly don't understand how things work in Riverside Heights. We're a close-knit community, and we don't appreciate newcomers trying to change our traditions. This space has always been shared, and that's not going to change just because you bought the house. I could feel other neighbors watching our exchange, some looking uncomfortable, others nodding along with Pat. It was clear this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding to clear up. I had no idea then that this was just the beginning of a battle that would eventually lead me to install an electric fence around my property, something I never thought I'd have to do in a supposedly friendly suburban neighborhood. After that disastrous Memorial Day confrontation, I spent hours poring over my property documents. Diana Wright, my real estate agent, had been thorough in providing everything, including historical surveys of the land. There was absolutely no mention of any community space or shared usage agreements. The entire 2 acres were mine, clear and simple, but Pat Miller had other ideas. The morning after I forced her group to relocate their gathering, I woke up to find small flags planted across my front lawn. They were the type surveyors use to mark boundaries, creating an arbitrary line that cut through about 1/3 of my front yard. I immediately called the city office to report that someone had placed unauthorized survey markers on my property. The city clerk sounded exhausted when I explained the situation. "Oh, you're the new owner on Maple Street," she said, sighing. "We've already received 3 calls this morning from Patricia Miller about rezoning requests for your property." I felt my blood pressure rising. Pat had already gone to the city, trying to officially claim part of my land as community space. Jennifer Chen, who lived across the street, stopped by later that day. She looked nervous as she approached my porch. "I thought you should know," she said, lowering her voice. "Pat's been going door to door, telling everyone that your property used to be part of the original town commons and was incorrectly parceled off decades ago. She's gathering signatures for some kind of petition." I thanked Jennifer for the warning, but inside I was seething. Pat wasn't just being difficult, she was actively trying to rewrite history to steal my land. I decided to do some research of my own and headed to the local library's archives section. The librarian helped me dig through old town records, and what I found was illuminating. Not only had my property never been part of any town commons, but Pat had tried similar tactics with other properties in the past. Tom Bennett, a local reporter who happened to be researching another story in the archives, overheard my conversation with the librarian. "Pat Miller," he said, shaking his head. "She tried to claim historical precedent on the Wilson property over on Oak Street last year. Claimed their vegetable garden was supposed to be a community victory garden from World War II. The poor family had to put up cameras after their tomatoes kept mysteriously disappearing. As I drove home, I noticed a group of people standing near my property line, Pat front and center, gesturing animatedly. I pulled into my driveway and watched as she led what appeared to be an impromptu tour of my front yard, pointing out where community amenities could be placed. This was getting out of hand. I decided to document everything. I set up security cameras and started keeping a detailed log of every interaction. Steve and Sarah Cooper, the young couple next door, offered to share their security footage too. They'd had their own run-ins with Pat when they first moved in and understood what I was up against. But Pat was crafty. She started organizing historical walking tours of the neighborhood that just happened to cross through my property. Groups of tourists would stop on my lawn while Pat regaled them with completely fabricated stories about the land's community, heritage. When I tried to stop them, she would loudly proclaim that I was destroying the neighborhood's historical character. The situation reached a new level of absurdity when I discovered Pat had submitted a proposal to the city council to have my front yard designated as a historical community gathering space. She'd included doctored photographs purporting to show decades of community events held on my property. Thankfully, Bob Thompson, my elderly neighbor, had lived in the area long enough to dispute her claims. That photo she's passing around of the 1976 bicentennial celebration. Bob told me, chuckling. That was taken in the actual town square, 3 blocks away. I should know. I helped organize it. Pat's just cropped the photo to make it look like it was on your property. But Pat had influence in the community, and some people were starting to believe her narrative. I'd catch groups of residents walking across my yard as if it were public property, giving me dirty looks when I asked them to leave. Someone even started putting up little community space signs along my property line every night. I'd take them down each morning only to find them replaced the next day. Richard Martinez, the HOA president, finally agreed to meet with me after weeks of dodging my calls. "Look," he said, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. "Pat's been a part of this community for a long time."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"She's very passionate about maintaining certain traditions. Maybe we could reach some kind of compromise." I stood my ground. "There's nothing to compromise about," I insisted. "This is private property, legally purchased. I'm not turning my front yard into a public park just because Pat Miller has decided it should be one." The meeting ended with Richard promising to look into the situation, but I could tell he was more interested in avoiding conflict than addressing the actual problem. As I left his office, I overheard him on the phone with Pat, assuring her that he was working on a solution that would benefit the community. That evening, I found Pat and several others setting up croquet wickets on my lawn. When I approached them, Pat smiled that calculating smile of hers. "Oh good, you're home," she said sweetly. "We're organizing a weekly croquet league for the neighborhood. The Historical Society is very interested in documenting the revival of traditional community activities in this space." I'd had enough. "Get off my property," I said firmly. "All of you, now." Pat's smile didn't waver. "You know," she said, her voice carrying so everyone could hear, "it's such a shame when people move into historical neighborhoods without any appreciation for tradition. This space has always been for everyone. Just because you have some paperwork doesn't change decades of community use." As I watched them slowly pack up their croquet set, making a show of how unreasonable I was being, I realized this wasn't going to stop. Pat had decided my property was public space, and she was willing to wage a campaign of attrition to get her way. But I had something she hadn't counted on: the truth, documentation, and now a growing determination to protect what was rightfully mine. I picked up one of the croquet wickets they'd left behind and studied it thoughtfully. Maybe it was time to consider some more serious security measures. The idea of an electric fence had crossed my mind, but I'd dismissed it as too extreme. Now, watching Pat's group retreat while shooting me disapproving glares, I wasn't so sure. Sometimes extreme problems require extreme solutions. The morning I decided to seriously consider installing an electric fence started like any other, except for the yoga class I found stretching on my front lawn at dawn. Pat Miller stood at the head of the group, leading them through sun salutations while making pointed comments about connecting with community spaces and shared natural environments. I watched from my kitchen window, coffee growing cold in my hand, as 20 people in colorful yoga pants flowed through their poses on my dewy grass. What really got me was the sign they'd set up: Riverside Heights Community Wellness Center. Free morning yoga. They'd even added my street address. I called the police non-emergency line again. Officer Mark Sullivan arrived 15 minutes later, looking as tired of this situation as I was. He'd been out 3 times in the past week alone. "Ms. Miller," he said, approaching the group, "we've discussed this. This is private property." Pat rolled up her yoga mat with deliberate slowness. "Officer Sullivan, how nice to see you again. We were just finishing our community wellness session. You know, studies show that shared green spaces improve mental health." She gestured to her group to pack up, but her smile had an edge to it. though some people clearly need more wellness activities than others. After the yoga group dispersed, Officer Sullivan pulled me aside. "Look, Mr. Harrison, I understand your frustration, but these calls are tying up police resources. Have you considered putting up some fencing? Make it clear this is private property?" I explained about the survey markers and signs that kept appearing, the Historical Society petition, and Pat's campaign to have my property designated as community space. Sullivan shook his head. "Document everything," he advised. "Take photos, keep records, and seriously consider that fence." Later that afternoon, Emily Watson from the City Council stopped by. She looked uncomfortable as she explained that Pat had submitted a formal proposal to create a historical community wellness park on my property. "She's gathered quite a few signatures," Emily admitted, "and she's been very persistent in following up." I invited Emily inside and spread out my property documents on the dining room table. "This is ridiculous," I said. "I have clear title to this land. Pat can't just decide it's public property because she wants it to be." Emily studied the papers, nodding. "The title is clear," she agreed, "but Pat's making a lot of noise about historical precedent and community access. She's even hired a local historian to try to prove this was once common land." As if on cue, we heard voices outside. Looking out the window, I saw Pat leading another group across my property, this time with an elderly man in a tweed jacket who was gesturing enthusiastically and taking notes. "And here," Pat's voice carried, "clearly through the window, you can still see evidence of the original community pathways." I'd had enough. I grabbed my phone and property documents and marched outside. The elderly man turned out to be Professor Alan Matthews, a local historian Pat had convinced to support her cause. I spread my documents on the hood of my car. "Professor Matthews, I'd like to show you something." The professor adjusted his glasses as I pointed out the property's complete history of ownership, dating back to the original land grants. His expression grew increasingly uncomfortable as he realized Pat's claims about historical community use were completely fabricated. "Ms. Miller," he said, turning to Pat, "you told me there was historical evidence of community ownership. These documents clearly show private ownership going back to the town's founding." Pat's face flushed red, but she recovered quickly. "Well, obviously the official records wouldn't show the informal community agreements that existed. Everyone knows this was always shared space." Emily Watson, who had followed me outside, cleared her throat. "Actually, Pat, making false claims about historical land use could be considered fraud, especially when submitting official proposals to the City Council." The group quickly dispersed, leaving Pat standing alone on my lawn. She straightened her tennis skirt and fixed me with a steely glare. "This isn't over," she said. "The community needs this space, and one way or another, we're going to have access to it." That night, I couldn't sleep. Pat's words kept echoing in my head. I knew she wasn't going to give up easily. The next morning, I found neighborhood flyers stuffed in everyone's mailboxes, announcing a community action meeting to protect our neighborhood's shared spaces from privatization. Frank Peterson, my lawyer, reviewed the flyer when I brought it to his office. "She's walking a fine line," he said. "She's careful not to directly claim ownership, but she's creating a false narrative about historical community use. We could pursue a defamation case, but that might escalate things further." I was considering my options when Jennifer Chen called. "Jack, you need to see this," she said urgently. "Pat's posted something on the neighborhood social media group." I pulled up the post and felt my stomach drop. Pat had written a lengthy piece about the tragedy of losing community spaces to private interests, complete with manufactured historical photos and emotional appeals about preserving neighborhood traditions. Worse, She'd included a schedule of upcoming community events planned for my property, including weekly farmers markets and children's nature classes. The comments section was filling up with residents expressing outrage about private interests stealing community space. People who had never even been to any supposed community events on my property were now sharing false memories about gatherings that had never happened. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my laptop screen, when I heard the distinct sound of hammering outside. Looking out, I saw Pat and several others installing a large sign at the edge of my property. Future site of Riverside Heights Community Wellness Park. Coming soon. That was the moment I made my decision. I pulled up the business card Officer Sullivan had given me for a security consultant and made the call. "I need information about electric fencing," I said. "Something that will make it absolutely clear this is private property." The consultant's voice was professional, matter of fact. "We can help with that, but you should know, once you go this route, it tends to make things interesting in the neighborhood." I watched through my window as more people gathered around Pat's sign, nodding approvingly and taking photos. "Interesting is fine," I replied. "I just need this to stop." Little did I know, my decision to install an electric fence would turn the entire neighborhood into a battleground, with Pat Miller leading the charge against what she would soon call my hostile fortification of community space. But I was done playing nice. It was time to show her and everyone else that some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. The security consultant arrived early on a Tuesday morning, his truck conspicuously unmarked. Dave Matthews wasn't what I expected. Dressed in khakis and a polo shirt, he looked more like an accountant than someone who specialized in deterrent fencing systems. He walked my property line slowly, taking measurements and making notes while I explained the situation. "An electric fence is serious business," he said, pausing to examine where Pat's community garden enthusiasts had already started tilling my soil without permission. "We're not talking about the kind of setup used for livestock. This will be more sophisticated, motion sensors, warning signs, and multiple deterrent levels. Are you sure you want to go this route?" Before I could answer, Pat appeared as if summoned, Power walking across my lawn with her tiny dog in tow. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice dripping with fake concern. "I couldn't help but notice you're taking measurements. I hope you're not planning anything that might interfere with the community's access to this historical space." Dave looked at me, eyebrows raised. I nodded slightly, and he turned to Pat with a professional smile. "Ma'am, I'm surveying this private property for a security installation. I'll need you to step back behind the property line." Pat's face darkened. "Security installation? This is outrageous. This space has always been open to the community. We have events planned here. Children use this area for nature studies." Her dog yapped in apparent agreement. "Not anymore," I said firmly. "I've documented 47 unauthorized entries onto my property in the past week alone. This stops now." Pat pulled out her phone, fingers flying over the screen. Within minutes, other neighbors started emerging from their houses, drawn by her mass text about urgent community action needed. Steve and Sarah Cooper from next door appeared too, but they stood quietly by my side, a small show of support that meant more than they knew. Richard Martinez, the HOA president, hurried over, looking flustered. "Now, let's not do anything hasty," he began, glancing nervously between Pat and me. "Perhaps we could discuss this at the next board meeting." "There's nothing to discuss," I replied. "I'm installing security measures on my private property. The HOA bylaws have no restrictions against electric fencing," I checked. I handed him a copy of the relevant documents, which Frank Peterson, my lawyer, had already reviewed. Pat's face had turned an interesting shade of red. "This is a declaration of war against the community," she announced loudly, turning to address the growing crowd. "He's trying to destroy our neighborhood's character with some kind of fortress." Dave quietly continued his measurements, occasionally making marks on the ground with orange spray paint. Each mark seemed to agitate Pat further. She paced along the property line, narrating every action into her phone's camera for her social media followers. "Breaking news, everyone," she declared dramatically. "The man who stole our community space is now planning to electrify it. Think of the children, think of the wildlife, think of our property values." I noticed Tom Bennett, the local reporter, hanging back and taking notes. He caught my eye and gave me a slight nod. At least someone might report this story accurately. Jennifer Chen approached me quietly. "Jack, I support what you're doing, but you should know, Pat's already started a social media campaign. She's calling it Save Our Community Space, and she's getting a lot of engagement. She's even talking about bringing in protesters." As if to prove her point, a car drove by slowly, the passenger filming with their phone. Great. I was about to become a social media spectacle. But I'd gone too far to back down now. Dave finished his initial survey and showed me his preliminary plans. The setup would be sophisticated, a graduated response system that would start with motion-activated lights and warning sounds before any actual electric deterrent came into play. Multiple warning signs would be posted in English and Spanish. The entire system would be camera monitored and legally compliant. As Dave explained the technical details, Pat orchestrated her own photo op. She'd arranged a group of children with hand-drawn signs reading "Save Our Park" and "No Electric Fences" to pose in front of my property. The fact that there had never been a park here seemed irrelevant to her narrative. Emily Watson from the City Council appeared, looking harried. "Mr. Harrison, could we discuss this privately?" She gestured toward my house. Inside, she spread out a stack of papers on my kitchen counter. "Pat's filed an emergency petition with the city. She's claiming the electric fence poses a public health risk and demanding an immediate stop work order." I showed her Dave's plans, including all the safety features and compliance certificates. "Everything here is legal," I assured her. "I'm protecting my private property from constant trespassing and unauthorized use." Emily sighed. "I know, and you're within your rights. But Pat's stirring up a lot of controversy. She's scheduled a press conference for this afternoon to discuss the militarization of community spaces." Her words, not mine. Outside, the crowd had grown. Pat had somehow manifested a folding table and was collecting signatures for yet another petition. I could see Bob and Nancy Thompson trying to reason with her, but she was in full community activist mode, gesturing wildly and pointing at my house. Dave pulled me aside. "I can start installation tomorrow," he said quietly, "but you should know, once we begin, this is likely to escalate. Are you prepared for that?" I watched as Pat handed out pre-printed signs to the gathering crowd. "Community over cruelty, and spaces not sparks." Someone had even brought a bullhorn. Through my security cameras, I could see people gathering on the sidewalk behind my property too. Pat had orchestrated a full surround. "Do it," I told Dave. "Start tomorrow, and make it obvious. I want everyone to see exactly what's being installed." He nodded, understanding what I meant. The fence itself would be a message. "This ends now." As Dave packed up his equipment, Pat's voice carried across the lawn through the bullhorn. "This is just the beginning. We won't let our community space be electrified. We'll be here every day until this hostile takeover of public land is stopped." That evening, as the protesters finally dispersed, I received an email from Frank Peterson. Pat had filed an emergency injunction trying to stop the fence installation, but she'd made a crucial mistake in her filing. She'd claimed decades of community use of the property, something easily disproven by historical records. I stood at my window, watching the last protesters leave, their signs discarded on my lawn. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. Pat thought she was ready for war, but she had no idea what was coming. Sometimes the best defense isn't just a good offense. It's 8,000 volts of clear boundary setting. The installation crew arrived at sunrise, their trucks rolling in quietly under the purple morning sky. Dave had suggested the early start, hoping to get the basic infrastructure in place before Pat's inevitable protest group assembled. 4 workers in grey uniforms began unloading equipment while Dave walked me through the day's timeline. We'll start with the support posts and basic wiring. Layout, he explained, showing me the updated plans. The actual electrical components won't go in until tomorrow, but by sunset, everyone will see exactly what's coming. A police cruiser parked across the street, Officer Sullivan keeping an eye on things. He'd warned me that Pat had filed multiple complaints about construction noise violations and unsafe equipment near public spaces. The irony of her suddenly caring about safety regulations wasn't lost on me. The morning peace lasted exactly 43 minutes. Pat emerged from her house like a general surveying the battlefield, phone already raised to document the assault on community space. She marched straight to the property line, her designer exercise outfit incongruous with the early hour. "This is completely unnecessary," she shouted, filming the workers as they methodically dug post holes. "You're destroying the neighborhood's character. Think about the children who play here." I approached her calmly, Officer Sullivan drifting closer just in case. "Pat, no children play here. This is private property, and after weeks of trespassing and harassment, I'm securing it. Please stay behind the property line." She switched to her live stream mode, narrating dramatically to her followers. "Breaking news! The hostile takeover continues. They're installing what essentially amounts to a prison fence around our beloved community space. This is the death of neighborhood values." The workers continued their tasks, professionals who'd clearly dealt with similar situations before. They installed high-visibility warning signs every 20 feet. "Danger, electric fence," in bold red letters, with detailed safety warnings in multiple languages below. By mid-morning, Pat's support group had arrived in force. They lined the sidewalk with signs and smartphones, documenting every post hole and wire installation. Someone had even brought a drone, attempting to get aerial footage until Officer Sullivan pointed out the local ordinances against unauthorized drone flights over private property. Emily Watson arrived looking exhausted, a thick folder tucked under her arm. "The city council's been flooded with calls," she told me. "Pat's organized some kind of email campaign. But here's the thing, she's actually helping your case. Every complaint about losing access to your property just reinforces that they've been trespassing." Richard Martinez from the HOA speed-walked up my driveway, waving a stack of papers. "We need to discuss this immediately. The association has concerns about the aesthetic impact of an electric fence on property values." I handed him the HOA bylaws, open to the relevant section. The bylaws specifically allow security fencing, including electric options, as long as they meet safety standards, which this does. I pointed to Dave's certification documents. There's no height or style restriction mentioned. Pat had recruited some local teenagers to walk back and forth along the sidewalk with protest signs, practicing their most disappointed headshakes whenever a worker drove in a support post. The signs ranged from earnest, community spaces to happy places, to dramatic, stop the electrocution of our dreams. Jennifer Chen brought me coffee and an update on the neighborhood social media situation. Pat had started multiple online groups: Save Our Community Space, Stop the Electric Fortress, and Neighbors Against Private Property Extremism. The last one seemed particularly ironic. Around noon, a local news van pulled up. Tom Bennett had kept his word about covering the story fairly, but this was a different channel, one Pat had apparently contacted. She immediately switched into what I'd started thinking of as her community activist mode, straightening her tennis skirt and practicing her concerned expression. This historic community space has been a gathering place for generations. She emoted to the camera, gesturing expansively across my lawn. Now one individual is destroying that legacy with an aggressive and dangerous barrier. We're not just losing a space, we're losing our neighborhood's soul. The reporter turned to me for comment. I simply held up my property deed and the approved fence permits. This is private property. The electric fence is fully compliant with all local regulations and is being installed in response to ongoing trespassing issues. Pat's expression tightened at the word trespassing, but she quickly recovered. We've had community events here for years. There are traditions to maintain. Really? I asked calmly. Could you show me any permits for these events? Any official documentation of this space being public? The reporter looked interested in this angle, but Pat quickly changed the subject, launching into an emotional speech about neighborhood unity and shared spaces. Behind her, the fence installation continued steadily. Frank Peterson arrived with an update on Pat's emergency injunction attempt. The judge dismissed it, he said, smiling slightly. Her claims of historical community use actually worked against her. The property records clearly show private ownership, so she essentially admitted to years of organized trespassing. As the afternoon wore on, Pat's protest took an unexpected turn. She arranged for a small chamber orchestra to set up on the sidewalk, playing mournful classical music as a funeral dirge for community space. The cellists seemed confused about why they were there, but played along professionally. Dave pulled me aside to show me the electrical system designs. We're installing a 3-tier response, he explained. First, motion sensors trigger warning, lights, then audible warnings in multiple languages. Only after those 2 clear warnings would anyone actually risk a shock. And even then, it's unpleasant, but not dangerous. Pat overheard this and immediately began broadcasting again. They're discussing shock torture levels. This is inhumane. We must stop this assault on public space. Officer Sullivan finally approached her. Ms. Miller, you need to stop using terms like torture and assault. This is a legal security installation on private property. You're veering into defamation territory. The day's light was fading when Dave's crew finished installing the basic framework. The poles stood tall, and secure, high-visibility wire channels running between them. Tomorrow would bring the actual electrical components, but already the message was clear. This property had boundaries, and they would be enforced. Pat gathered her remaining protesters for one final photo op as the workers packed up. This isn't over, she announced both to me and her livestream audience. Tomorrow, we'll be back in full force. This fence won't stop us from reclaiming our community space. I watched them disperse, noting how carefully they now stayed on the sidewalk. Sometimes the mere suggestion of a boundary was enough to start enforcing it. But tomorrow would bring the actual power, and with it I suspected Pat's most dramatic performance yet. Later that night, reviewing my security cameras, I caught Pat walking her tiny dog past my property. She stopped to study the fence framework, her expression unreadable in the darkness. For a moment, she seemed almost uncertain, maybe finally realizing that her campaign of entitlement was about to meet its match. Then she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and marched away, already typing on her phone. No doubt planning. Tomorrow's protest performance. Let her plan, I thought. Tomorrow, things would change permanently. Pat was about to learn that some lines aren't meant to be crossed, especially when those lines carry enough voltage to make her designer exercise outfit stand on end. Sunrise brought an unexpected sight. Pat Miller had organized an actual candlelight vigil on the sidewalk surrounding my property. 24 people stood solemnly holding electric candles, wearing black armbands with "Save Our Space" printed in white letters. Someone was softly playing Amazing Grace on a flute. Dave's installation crew arrived to find their work area surrounded by mourners. 15 years in the business, Dave muttered, shaking his head, and this is a new one. He gathered his team for a briefing, while Pat led her group in what appeared to be a moment of silence for the death of community spirit. The electrical components arrived in unmarked boxes, which immediately sent Pat into investigation mode. She paced the sidewalk, narrating into her phone. They're bringing in mysterious equipment. What dangerous devices are they installing in our beloved community space? Officer Sullivan had been replaced by Officer Rodriguez, who looked considerably less patient with the theatrical display. She established clear boundaries for the protesters, ensuring they wouldn't interfere with the installation work. Pat tested these limits immediately, attempting to accidentally cross onto my property while directing her photographer for dramatic shots. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said firmly, "if you cross that line again, you'll be charged with trespassing. Your right to protest ends at the property boundary." The morning's entertainment reached new heights when Pat unveiled her latest protest strategy, a group of interpretive dancers performing what she called the Dance of Lost Community. 5 people in flowing clothes moved dramatically around the sidewalk, expressing their apparent grief through modern dance. Tom Bennett showed up with his camera, barely concealing his amusement. "You know," he said quietly, "I've covered protests against nuclear power plants that had less drama than this." The real work continued, despite the theatrical backdrop. Dave's team methodically installed the electrical systems, security cameras, and motion sensors. Each component was tested and certified, with multiple safety features and fail-safes. Warning signs became more specific. Electric fence, multiple warning system in place, proceed at your own risk. Mid-morning brought a surprise visitor. Diana Wright, my real estate agent, looking concerned. "Jack, I had to come see this for myself. Pat's been calling every realtor in town, claiming this fence will destroy property values. She's trying to organize some kind of real estate agent protest." I showed Diana the property records and documentation of Pat's escalating trespassing. "The fence is adding security features to a valuable property," I pointed out. "If anything, it should increase the value." Diana studied the installation, nodding slowly. "You know what? You're right. I'm going to document this. It might actually make a great selling point for future listings. Secure estate with advanced privacy features." Pat overheard this and immediately switched tactics. "They're conspiring to gentrify our historic neighborhood," she announced to her live stream audience. "This is the beginning of turning our community into a gated fortress." The afternoon brought new dimensions to Pat's protest theater. She'd somehow convinced a group of local musicians to form a protest orchestra, complete with a conductor, in formal attire. They set up on the sidewalk, playing increasingly dramatic pieces as the electrical work progressed. Richard Martinez made another appearance, this time with an HOA lawyer in tow. The lawyer spent exactly 5 minutes reviewing my permits and documentation before informing Richard that everything was perfectly legal. Pat, who had been hovering nearby with her phone ready to record any confrontation, visibly deflated. "Jennifer, Chen brought me updates from the neighborhood social media front. Pat had started a new online campaign, Voices Against the Voltage. She was collecting dramatic testimonials about imaginary community events supposedly held on my property over the years. Someone actually wrote about a wedding that supposedly happened on your front lawn last summer," Jennifer said, scrolling through her phone. "You know, when the previous owners were still here and the property was for sale." The technical work continued steadily. Dave's team installed the sophisticated control panel that would manage the 3-tier warning system. Motion sensors were calibrated, cameras were aligned, and the actual electrical components were carefully connected and tested. Pat seized on each testing phase as an opportunity for fresh outrage. When the motion sensor lights were tested, she declared it light pollution terrorism. The warning speaker test prompted accusations of sonic warfare against the community. By the time they tested the actual electrical current, she had worked herself into a state of near hysteria. "They're electrifying our dreams," she wailed into her phone camera. "Our children's heritage is being shocked into submission." Officer Rodriguez finally intervened. "Ms. Miller, you need to stop making inflammatory statements about public safety. The fence meets all legal requirements and has multiple warning systems." As the day progressed, Pat's protests took increasingly creative turns. She organized a community history reading where people shared obviously fictional memories of events on my property. One elderly man gave a tearful account of a neighborhood picnic supposedly held there in 1962, 3 decades before the house was even built. Frank Peterson stopped by with news from the legal front. Pat had attempted to file another emergency injunction, this time claiming the fence violated historical preservation codes. The judge had dismissed it without a hearing, noting that the property had no historical designation and the fence met all current building codes. The installation entered its final phases as the sun began to set. Dave's team conducted thorough safety checks, testing each component of the security system. The 3-tier warning system was calibrated, motion-activated lights first, then clear audio warnings, and only then the actual electrical deterrent. Pat gathered her remaining protesters for one final demonstration. They formed a circle on the sidewalk, holding hands and singing what appeared to be a hastily rewritten version of "We Shall Overcome," with lyrics about community spaces and evil electric fences. As twilight deepened, Dave handed me the control, panel key, and security system documentation. "Everything's set and certified," he said. "The system will be active at midnight. Anyone trying to access your property will get plenty of warning before they reach the electric barrier." Pat stood at the edge of my property, watching the final preparations with an unreadable expression. The security lights activated as she stepped slightly too close, making her jump back. For a moment, reality seemed to pierce her self-righteous bubble. Then she straightened her designer exercise outfit, lifted her chin, and addressed her dwindling audience. "This is not the end. We will continue our fight against this assault on community values. Tomorrow, we begin our campaign of peaceful resistance." I watched her lead her remaining supporters away, already planning tomorrow's performance. But something had changed. The physical reality of the fence, with its lights and warnings and very real consequences, had shifted the dynamic. Pat's fictional narrative of community space was about to collide with 8,000 volts of reality. Later that night, reviewing the security footage, I watched Pat make one final pass by my property. She approached the fence line slowly, then reached out as if to touch it. The motion sensors triggered, flooding the area with light, and she quickly withdrew her hand. Perhaps finally, she was beginning to understand that some boundaries aren't just legal documents, they're electrified reality checks. The morning after the fence activation brought unexpected quiet. Too quiet. No protesters, no interpretive dancers, not even Pat's usual power-walking route past my property. The only sound was the gentle hum of the security system doing its job. My security cameras had captured some interesting overnight footage. Around 2 a.m., a shadowy figure that looked suspiciously like Pat had approached the fence line, only to be startled back by the motion sensor lights. An hour later, someone had attempted to plant protest signs in my yard, but retreated quickly when the warning system activated. Steve Cooper wandered over while I was checking the morning mail. "You might want to see Pat's latest social media post," he said, holding out his phone. There it was, a professionally edited video titled "Living Under Siege, One Communities. Fight Against Electrification." The thumbnail showed Pat posed dramatically beside the fence, looking like a resistance fighter in her Lululemon outfit. The doorbell rang around 10. A stern-looking man in a suit introduced himself as Michael Anderson, Pat's new lawyer. "Ms. Miller has asked me to present you with this formal complaint," he said, handing over a thick envelope. "She's alleging emotional distress due to the loss of community access." Frank Peterson reviewed the complaint over video chat, barely containing his amusement. "She's claiming that the fence has caused her severe psychological trauma by preventing her from practicing her daily meditation in your yard. She's also demanding compensation for having to relocate her community yoga sessions." A small crowd gathered at the end of my driveway, led by Richard Martinez. The HOA president looked nervous as he approached the intercom I'd installed at the gate. "We need to discuss the aesthetic impact of your security measures," he began, but was interrupted by the system's automated warning message. "Attention, you are approaching private property. Please maintain distance from the electric fence." The group jumped back collectively, even though they were nowhere near the actual electrical barrier. Pat's campaign of fear had apparently convinced people that the entire property was now somehow electrified. Emily Watson called with updates from the city council. "Pat's latest petition is creative," she said diplomatically. "She's requesting that the council declare your front yard a historical meditation zone based on its alleged use for spiritual practices dating back to the 1960s. The afternoon brought a new form of protest. Pat had organized what she called a community space memorial service. People dressed in black gathered on the sidewalk, sharing obviously fictional memories of events that had supposedly taken place on my property. "Remember the great neighborhood picnic of '82? One woman sobbed into a microphone. "My daughter took her first steps right where that horrible fence stands." I checked the property records again. In 1982, this entire area had been an undeveloped woodland lot. Tom Bennett showed up with his camera, documenting the increasingly absurd situation. "You know," he said, "Pat tried something similar last year with the community center. Claimed it was built on an ancient meditation ground. Turned out it was a former parking lot." The memorial service reached its peak when Pat unveiled a small bronze plaque she'd had made. "In memory of community space, killed by privatization and electricity." She attempted to mount it on my gatepost, but retreated quickly when the warning system activated. Officer Rodriguez drove by regularly, checking on the situation. "Had an interesting call this morning," she mentioned during one pass. "Someone reported that your fence was interfering with their spiritually significant dog-walking route." Jennifer Chen brought lunch and neighborhood gossip. Pat had apparently been going door to door, collecting testimonials about the fence's negative energy impact on the community. She'd even convinced some residents to participate in what she called an electromagnetic aura cleansing ceremony on the sidewalk. The ceremony itself was something to behold. Pat led a group of people waving sage bundles and crystals at my fence, chanting about releasing trapped community energy. The motion sensors kept triggering, creating an unintentionally comic light show. Frank Peterson called with more legal updates. Pat's lawyer had filed a motion claiming the fence violated religious freedom by preventing access to what she now called sacred community ground. The judge's response had been brief and pointed. Private property rights are not superseded by retroactively declared spiritual significance. By mid-afternoon, Pat had shifted tactics again. She'd hired a self-proclaimed electromagnetic field specialist who walked the perimeter of my property with various beeping devices, making concerned noises about disrupted community energy fields. Diana Wright stopped by with interesting news from the real estate front. "You're not going to believe this," she said, "but your fence has actually sparked a trend. 3 other homeowners in the area have inquired about similar security systems. Turns out people like the idea of clearly marked boundaries." The day's most surprising visitor was Professor Matthews, the historian Pat had previously tried to recruit for her cause. He looked embarrassed as he handed me a folder. "I thought you should have these," he said. "Historical aerial photographs of the area. They clearly show this was private property long before the neighborhood was developed. Ms. Miller's claims about traditional community use are completely fabricated." As evening approached, Pat made one final attempt at drama. She organized what she called a light of community protest, where people stood on the sidewalk holding candles and humming what sounded like off-key folk songs. The effect was somewhat undermined by the security lights automatically activating whenever anyone got too close to the property line. Just before sunset, a delivery truck arrived with an unexpected package, a box of custom t-shirts Pat had ordered for her protesters. The shirts read, "Voltage versus Village, the fight for community space." Unfortunately for Pat, the delivery driver couldn't cross the clearly marked property line to deliver them to her impromptu sidewalk merchandise table. I watched from my security cameras as Pat finally headed home, carrying her box of unsold t-shirts. She paused at the edge of my property, staring at the fence with what looked like genuine confusion. Perhaps she was finally realizing that her imagined community ownership didn't trump actual property rights. Later that night, reviewing the day's security footage, I noticed something interesting. Despite all the protests and ceremonies, not a single person had actually tried to cross the fence line after the initial warning system activated. Pat's theatrical resistance was just that. Theater. The reality of clear, enforced boundaries was already changing behavior. The fence hummed quietly in the darkness, its warning lights occasionally activating as nocturnal wildlife passed by. Tomorrow would undoubtedly bring new dramatic performances from Pat and her followers. But for now, my property was secure. Sometimes the best community relations are built on clearly marked and well-enforced boundaries. The local news vans arrived before dawn. Pat had orchestrated her biggest media event yet, a sunrise community healing ceremony, complete with professional lighting and a meditation guru she'd hired from 3 towns over. The guru, dressed in flowing white robes that suspiciously still had price tags attached, led a group of bleary-eyed protesters in chanting about restoring natural energy flow to violated spaces. Frank Peterson called early, trying to contain his laughter. "She's filed another legal motion. This time she's claiming your fence violates ancient ley lines and disrupts the neighborhood's spiritual energy grid. She's actually included a hand-drawn map of supposed mystical energy paths that conveniently all cross through your front yard." The meditation ceremony was interrupted by Dave's scheduled maintenance visit. His truck's arrival sent the guru scrambling mid-chant, apparently concerned about mixing mystical energy with actual electricity. Pat quickly reframed the interruption for her live-stream audience. "Look how they deliberately disrupt our spiritual connection to community space." Officer Rodriguez had been replaced by Officer Thompson, who took one look at the scene and radioed for backup. "Just in case," he explained. "Ms. Miller's social media suggests she's planning something called Operation Reclamation for this afternoon." By mid-morning, Pat's performative resistance had evolved into something resembling a New Age festival. Someone had set up crystal arrays along the sidewalk, supposedly to redirect negative electrical energy. A self-proclaimed aura photographer was taking pictures of the fence, claiming to capture its hostile vibrational impact on film. Jennifer Chen brought coffee and intelligence from the neighborhood social media front lines. Pat had started a GoFundMe campaign, Save our sacred space from electromagnetic oppression. The campaign description included increasingly elaborate claims about the property's spiritual significance, including a completely fabricated Native American blessing ceremony that had supposedly occurred there last year. The situation took an unexpected turn when a local TV station arrived to film a human interest story. The reporter, clearly expecting to document heartless property owner versus community spirit, instead discovered the extensive history of Pat's trespassing and fabricated claims. The resulting interview didn't go quite as Pat had planned. "So, Ms. Miller," the reporter asked, "you claim this has been community space for generations, but property records show it was undeveloped woodland until 1995. How do you explain that discrepancy?" Pat's response was a masterclass in evasion. "Historical records don't capture the spiritual truth of community spaces," she declared, waving a crystal wand for emphasis. "Some connections transcend mere documentation." Emily Watson arrived with news from the City Council. "Pat's latest petition is unique," she said diplomatically. "She's requesting that the council declare your property a zone of electromagnetic sensitivity, requiring immediate de-electrification." The afternoon brought Pat's mysterious Operation Reclamation. It turned out to be an elaborate attempt to cleanse my property's aura through synchronized interpretive dance. Dozens of people in matching tie-dye shirts moved in choreographed patterns along the sidewalk, led by an enthusiastic instructor with a megaphone. "Channel the community's energy," the instructor shouted. "Visualize the fence dissolving into love and light." The fence, unsurprisingly, remained solidly physical. Richard Martinez made another appearance, this time accompanied by the entire HOA board. They watched in bewilderment as the dancers attempted to create a spiritual energy vortex through synchronized movement. "I'm beginning to think the fence might actually be good for property values," one board member muttered. "At least it keeps the interpretive dancers on the sidewalk." Tom Bennett had brought a video crew to document the spectacle. "You know," he said, reviewing the footage, "I've covered protests at nuclear power plants that had less discussion of energy fields." The day's most surprising visitor was Diana Wright, accompanied by 3 potential buyers for a property down the street. "The fence has become a selling point," she explained. "People like knowing there's at least one neighbor who takes security seriously." Pat's response to this development was to organize an emergency property value protection ceremony. This involved a circle of people holding real estate listings and chanting about maintaining community aesthetic harmony. Frank Peterson called with updates from the legal front. Pat's lawyer had attempted to subpoena my property's electromagnetic field readings from before and after the fence installation. The judge's response had been succinct. "This court does not recognize crystal-based evidence." The afternoon's entertainment reached new heights when Pat unveiled her latest protest innovation, a community space remembrance wall. She and her supporters had created a memorial display on the sidewalk, complete with photoshopped pictures of events that had supposedly taken place on my property. "Look at this beautiful community picnic from 1975, Pat declared to her live stream audience, pointing to a clearly edited photo. The fact that the image showed modern cars and smartphones in the background didn't seem to bother her. Steve and Sarah Cooper provided running commentary from their front porch, sharing popcorn as they watched Pat's increasingly elaborate performance. "It's better than Netflix," Sarah remarked as Pat led her group in a boundary dissolution visualization exercise. The visualization was interrupted by the fence's warning system activating. Apparently, spiritual energy wasn't exempt from motion sensors. Pat quickly incorporated this into her narrative, declaring it electromagnetic oppression of community consciousness. As evening approached, Pat gathered her remaining supporters for what she called a light language ceremony to communicate with the fence's energy field. This involved a group of people making high-pitched tones at various frequencies, supposedly to convince the fence to recognize its role in community division. The fence, being an inanimate object, remained unmoved by the sonic appeal. Dave stopped by to check the security readings, bemused by the ongoing performance art on the sidewalk. "In 15 years of installing security systems," he said, "I've never seen someone try to negotiate with a fence through interpretive sound healing." The day's final act involved Pat attempting to cleanse the electrical field with a large copper pyramid she'd ordered online. The pyramid, unfortunately, turned out to be too wide to fit on the sidewalk without violating city ordinances about blocking pedestrian access. Officer Thompson had to intervene when Pat tried to argue that spiritual devices transcend municipal code regulations. The pyramid was reluctantly relocated to Pat's front yard, where she insisted it was still transmitting cleansing energy to the community space. As night fell and the protesters finally dispersed, I reviewed the day's security footage. Despite all the ceremonies, chants, and synchronized movements, one fact remained clear. Not a single person had attempted to actually cross the electrified boundary. Sometimes the most effective spiritual awakening comes from 8,000 volts of reality. A mysterious package arrived at my doorstep early Tuesday morning, a thick manila envelope with no return address. Inside, I found dozens of printed emails, social media messages, and meeting minutes. Someone had anonymously leaked Pat Miller's entire campaign strategy for reclaiming community space. The documents revealed something stunning. Pat had attempted similar land grabs in 3 other neighborhoods before moving to Riverside Heights. Each time, she'd used the same playbook: fabricated historical claims, orchestrated protests, and increasingly bizarre spiritual appeals. Each time, she'd eventually been forced to back down when confronted with legal reality. Frank Peterson was particularly interested in one email thread where Pat discussed her community space acquisition strategy with fellow activists. "This is gold," he said during our morning video call. She explicitly acknowledges that she knows these properties are private, but believes she can pressure owners into surrendering them through coordinated community action. The morning's drama began with Pat's latest media spectacle, a press conference announcing the formation of Citizens Against Residential Electrification, CARE. She'd set up a podium on the sidewalk, complete with professional lighting and a background banner showing my fence photographed from an ominous angle. "We're seeing a disturbing trend of homeowners fortifying their properties against community access," Pat declared to the assembled reporters. "This threatens the very fabric of neighborhood life." The fact that she was basically admitting to organized trespassing seemed lost on her. Emily Watson called with interesting news from City Hall. "Remember how Pat claimed your property was you?" Historically significant. We found records of her trying to block the original housing development in 1995, claiming the empty woodland was an essential community birdwatching site. She actually sued to try to prevent any houses from being built here. The afternoon brought a surprise visit from Linda Martinez, Richard's wife and longtime resident. She seemed nervous as she handed me a stack of old photographs. "I found these in our attic," she explained. "They show this whole area before development. Pat's claims about traditional community use, well, these prove it was all private woodland until the housing development. Nobody was holding meditation circles or community picnics here." Tom Bennett arrived to document this latest development, his camera capturing Pat's reaction when she spotted Linda leaving my property. The look of betrayal on Pat's face was priceless. Another crack in her carefully constructed narrative. The leaked documents had an unexpected effect on Pat's protest. Movement Several longtime supporters, discovering they'd been misled about the property's history, quietly distanced themselves from her cause. The morning's electromagnetic resistance circle was noticeably smaller than usual. Jennifer Chen brought updates from the neighborhood social media scene. Pat had started deleting old posts about historical community events on my property, apparently realizing they could be used as evidence of knowingly false claims. But screenshots had already been saved, documenting her evolving narrative. By mid-afternoon, Pat attempted to regain control of the situation with a new angle. She announced an emergency community meeting on the sidewalk to discuss the militarization of residential spaces. The small group that gathered looked increasingly skeptical as she presented her plans for restoration of community access. Diana Wright drove by with more real estate insights. 3 more homeowners in the area have inquired about security fencing, she reported. Pat's actually creating a trend. People are starting to think more seriously about property boundaries. The day's most interesting visitor was Professor Matthews, who'd brought additional historical documentation. I've been researching the area's development, he explained, spreading out old maps on my kitchen counter. Not only was this never community space, but Pat actually tried to buy this property herself when it was first developed. She was outbid and has been trying to control it ever since. Frank Peterson called with news about Pat's latest legal maneuver. She'd filed a motion claiming the fence violated international human rights conventions about community access to traditional spaces. The judge's response had been memorable. Local zoning laws are not subject to international tribunal review. As afternoon faded into evening, Pat made one final attempt to rally support. She'd organized what she called a community space remembrance vigil, complete with printed programs and a professional photographer. But the leaked documents had done their damage. Barely a dozen people showed up, most looking uncomfortable, as Pat shared obviously fictional memories of the property's past. Officer Thompson stopped by to check on the situation. Interesting development, he mentioned. We've had similar complaints about Pat's behavior in other jurisdictions. Seems like this isn't her first attempt at claiming private property for community use. The evening's entertainment reached its peak when Pat tried to present a community impact study she'd commissioned. The document, clearly hastily prepared, claimed that property fencing led to everything from decreased butterfly migration to disrupted social bonds. The few remaining protesters shifted awkwardly as she insisted that my fence was single-handedly destroying neighborhood unity. Steve and Sarah Cooper provided running commentary from their driveway. Notice how she never mentions trying to buy this property herself, Sarah observed. Kind of changes the whole community space narrative when you know she wanted it for private use. Dave arrived for a routine security check, bringing news from other neighborhoods. You've started something, he said, showing me photos of similar security installations in nearby areas. People are realizing it's okay to enforce boundaries. As night fell, Pat made one last attempt to salvage her campaign. She announced plans for a community space documentation project, asking residents to share memories of using my property before the fence. The uncomfortable silence that followed spoke volumes. The truth had finally caught up with her narrative. Later that night, reviewing security footage, I caught an interesting moment. Pat stood alone at the edge of my property, staring at the fence. For a brief moment, her carefully maintained activist facade cracked, revealing something that looked like resignation. Perhaps the leaked documents had finally forced her to confront the reality of her actions. The fence hummed quietly, its warning lights casting steady illumination into the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would likely bring new protests, new accusations, new attempts to claim what wasn't hers. But something had shifted. The foundation of Pat's campaign had cracked, revealing the truth about her history of attempted land grabs and manufactured outrage. In the end, it wasn't just the electric fence that protected my property, it was the power of documented truth, finally cutting through years of carefully constructed fiction. Sometimes the best defense against false claims isn't voltage, but verifiable facts. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor to my door, Mike Anderson, Pat's former lawyer. He looked uncomfortable as he handed me a letter. "I'm withdrawing as Ms. Miller's legal counsel," he explained. "After reviewing the leaked documents, I cannot ethically continue representing her claims about your property." The morning news carried the story of Pat's previous attempts at claiming private land for community use in other neighborhoods. Tom Bennett's investigative piece was thorough, featuring interviews with homeowners who dealt with similar tactics. The parallels were striking. The same claims about historical community use, the same orchestrated protests, even the same spiritual ceremonies. Richard Martinez called an emergency HOA meeting to address the situation. The conference room at the local library was packed as residents gathered to discuss Pat's history of property disputes. The mood had shifted dramatically. People who'd once supported her community space campaign now expressed concern about her pattern of targeting private properties. Diana Wright presented property value data showing that secured homes with clear boundaries actually commanded higher prices. "The market values privacy and security," she explained to the attentive audience. Ms. Miller's claims about the fence, decreasing property values, are demonstrably false. Meanwhile, Pat attempted to salvage her campaign with a new strategy. She announced the formation of a Truth and Reconciliation Committee for Community Spaces. The irony of including truth in the title wasn't lost on anyone, given the recent revelations about her history. Jennifer Chen monitored the neighborhood, social media channels as Pat's supporters began questioning her tactics. "Remember the meditation circle she claimed had been meeting on your property for decades?" Jennifer showed me screenshots of residents discovering that Pat had organized similar fake historical claims in other neighborhoods. Emily Watson brought updates from the city council. "We've received formal complaints from 2 other municipalities about Ms. Miller's activities," she explained. She apparently tried to claim private beachfront property as traditional community fishing grounds in Harbor Town last year. Frank Peterson reviewed the mounting evidence with evident satisfaction. "She's managed to create a perfect storm of legal liability," he observed. "False claims, organized harassment, attempted property appropriation. It's all documented now." The afternoon brought a bizarre attempt at damage control. Pat organized what she called a community truth-sharing circle on the sidewalk. The event backfired spectacularly when several longtime residents stood up to share their actual memories of the area before development. Bob Thompson, who'd lived in the neighborhood since before the housing development, spoke up clearly. "This was all private woodland owned by the Johnson family," he stated firmly. "Nobody was holding community events here. Ms. Miller knows this. She tried to buy this lot herself when it was first developed." Professor Matthews arrived with additional historical records, including Pat's failed bid to purchase my property when it was first developed. "She submitted multiple appeals trying to block the housing development," he explained. "When that failed, she tried to buy several lots. Only after losing out did she start claiming it was community space." Officer Rodriguez watched from her patrol car as Pat's remaining supporters processed this information. Several people quietly removed their Save Our Community Space buttons and drifted away from the gathering. Pat's carefully constructed narrative was unraveling in real time. Steve and Sarah Cooper shared security footage from their cameras showing Pat removing her own protest signs late at night, apparently trying to erase evidence of her campaign. The timestamp clearly showed her attempting to clean up her digital trail after the documents leaked. Dave stopped by for a routine maintenance check on the fence. You know what's interesting? He mused, showing me his work schedule. I've got 3 other installations pending in neighborhoods where Ms. Miller previously tried her community space claims. People are learning from your example. Linda Martinez brought over a casserole and more revelations. Richard found old HOA minutes, she confided. Pat tried to block every single fence installation in the neighborhood, claiming they violated community access rights. She's been playing this game for years. The evening news featured interviews with residents from other neighborhoods where Pat had attempted similar land grabs. Their stories were strikingly similar. The same tactics, the same claims, the same escalating protests when property owners refused to give in to her demands. Tom Bennett's follow-up piece included satellite imagery showing the historical development of the area. These images clearly show there was no community use of this property, he explained. It was private woodland until development, then private residential lots. Ms. Miller's claims about traditional community access are completely fabricated. Pat made one final attempt to control the narrative, calling for a neighborhood healing session to move past divisions and restore community harmony. The few people who attended watched skeptically as she tried to reframe her actions as passionate advocacy for shared spaces. Frank Peterson called with news about Pat's legal situation. Multiple property owners from other neighborhoods were considering legal action over her previous false claims and harassment campaigns. The documentation from my case had opened the floodgates. As evening approached, Pat's remaining supporters gathered for what they called a community reflection circle. The mood was subdued as people discussed the revelations about her history of targeting private properties. Even her most dedicated followers seemed to be questioning their involvement. Diana Wright reported that 3 more properties in the area had begun the process of installing security fencing. Your stand against false claims has started a trend, she noted. People are realizing it's okay to protect their property rights. Jennifer Chen showed me updated neighborhood social media posts. Residents were sharing their own stories of Pat's attempts to control private property through claims of community access. A clear pattern emerged of targeted harassment disguised as community advocacy. The day ended with Pat standing alone on the sidewalk, her carefully constructed narrative in shambles. The electric fence hummed quietly, its warning lights illuminating the truth about her campaign. Sometimes the biggest threat to false claims isn't electricity, it's exposure to the light of documented facts. Later that night, reviewing security footage, I caught Pat removing the last of her "Save Our Community Space" signs from the neighborhood. Her movement to claim private property for public use had finally encountered something it couldn't overcome: the truth about her history of manufactured outrage and false claims. The fence stood as a symbol of more than just property boundaries. It represented the community's growing understanding that good neighbors respect legal property rights. Pat's campaign hadn't just failed to claim my land, it had exposed a pattern of behavior that would make future land grabs impossible. The certified letter arrived on Monday morning. Inside was an official notice from Pat's homeowner's insurance company, informing her that they were dropping her coverage due to documented pattern of high-risk behavior and potential liability issues. The insurance company had reviewed the evidence of her organized trespassing campaigns and decided she was too much of a risk. Frank Peterson called with even more developments. 3 separate homeowners associations from Pat's previous neighborhoods had filed formal complaints about her history of false property claims. They'd included extensive documentation of her attempts to seize private land through manufactured community outrage. Emily Watson arrived with surprising news from the City Council. "We've uncovered something interesting in the archived records," she explained, spreading documents across my kitchen counter. Pat actually opposed the original development of this entire neighborhood. She filed multiple appeals claiming the woodland was sacred community space that couldn't be developed. The morning's entertainment began when Pat attempted to hold a press conference announcing her new Community Space Reconciliation Initiative. The local media, now aware of her history, asked pointed questions about her previous attempts to claim private property in other neighborhoods. Her rehearsed speech about community unity fell flat against the documented pattern of her actions. Tom Bennett's latest investigative piece revealed that Pat had attempted to purchase multiple properties in the neighborhood over the years, only turning to community space claims after her offers were rejected. The article included interviews with real estate agents who remembered her aggressive bidding tactics. Diana Wright brought interesting market analysis. Properties with secure boundaries are selling at a premium now, she explained. Your stand against false claims has actually increased neighborhood property values. People appreciate knowing their property rights will be respected. Richard Martinez called an emergency HOA board meeting to address the mounting evidence of Pat's pattern of behavior. The board voted unanimously to send her a formal warning about using HOA meetings to make false claims about private property. Even her previous supporters on the board had turned against her tactics. Jennifer Chen monitored the neighborhood. Social media channels as residents shared their own experiences with Pat's attempted land grabs. She tried to claim my garden was a traditional community herb sanctuary last year, one neighbor wrote. When I refused to let her harvest my vegetables, she organized protests about privatizing community resources. The afternoon brought a surprise visit from Linda Martinez. I found these in our files, she said, producing a stack of old letters. Pat tried to block our fence installation 5 years ago. She claimed our backyard was a critical community butterfly corridor that couldn't be enclosed. Officer Rodriguez stopped by with updates from other precincts. We've received similar reports from 3 other neighborhoods, she explained. Same pattern. She moves in, targets private properties, creates false historical claims, and organizes protests when owners don't comply. Professor Matthews contributed more historical context. I've been researching the area's development, he shared. Before the housing development, this was private farmland. There's no evidence of any community use. Ms. Miller's claims about traditional public access are completely fabricated. Dave reported increasing interest in security systems from other neighborhoods. Your story has spread, he explained. People are realizing they don't have to tolerate false claims about their property. The electric fence has become a symbol of standing up to organized harassment. The afternoon's drama peaked when Pat attempted one final community gathering. She called it a neighborhood unity summit, but only a handful of people attended. Her impassioned speech about healing community divisions rang hollow against the backdrop of her exposed tactics. Sarah Cooper shared security footage showing Pat removing evidence of her previous protests. She's been taking down all her "Save Our Community Space" signs in the middle of the night, Sarah reported, trying to erase the evidence of her campaign. Frank Peterson brought news of mounting legal pressure. Property owners from Pat's previous neighborhoods were organizing a class action lawsuit over her pattern of false claims and organized harassment. The documentation from my case had provided the evidence they needed. Emily Watson reported that the city council had launched an investigation into Pat's previous property disputes. We're finding a clear pattern of behavior, she explained. She's tried these tactics in multiple jurisdictions, always using the same playbook of false historical claims and manufactured outrage. Diana Wright showed me real estate listings from neighborhoods where Pat had previously attempted her community space claims. Property values actually increased after homeowners stood up to her tactics, she noted. Buyers appreciate knowing their property rights will be protected. The evening brought an unexpected scene. Pat removing her. Community space memorial from the sidewalk. The bronze plaque commemorating imaginary historical events disappeared quietly into her car trunk, along with the remaining protest signs and spiritual ceremony supplies. Tom Bennett's cameras captured the moment Pat realized her campaign had finally failed. She stood at the edge of my property, staring at the electric fence that had become a symbol of resistance to her false claims. For once, she had no audience, no protesters, no cameras, except Tom's documenting her defeat. Jennifer. Jen reported that Pat's social media groups were rapidly losing members. People are deleting their posts about community traditions on your property, she said. No one wants to be associated with her campaign now that the truth is out. Professor Matthews brought final confirmation of the property's history. I've completed my research, he announced. This land has been continuously private property since the original land grants. There's no evidence of any community use, traditional or otherwise. As night fell, Pat made one last walk past my property. The security lights activated, illuminating her solitary figure. She paused, looking at the fence that had sparked the exposure of her tactics. Without an audience, without cameras, without her usual theatrical flourish, she finally turned away. The electric fence hummed quietly, maintaining its steady guard. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Pat's campaign of false claims and manufactured outrage had been permanently exposed. Sometimes the most effective defense isn't just physical barriers. It's the power of truth to illuminate years of carefully constructed deception. The moving truck appeared in Pat's driveway early Sunday morning. No announcements, no social media posts, no organized farewell ceremonies, just quiet loading of boxes and furniture. The self-proclaimed defender of community spaces was leaving Riverside Heights, her campaign of false claims finally finished. Frank Peterson brought the final legal documents. Pat had signed a binding agreement admitting her false claims about my property and agreeing to cease all attempts to organize protests or make public statements about community access. The settlement included similar agreements with property owners from her previous neighborhoods. Emily Watson stopped by with city council updates. We've implemented new guidelines for verifying historical property claims, she explained. The Pat Miller Ordinance, though we're calling it something else officially, requires documented evidence before anyone can claim traditional community use of private property. Diana Wright arrived with market analysis showing an interesting trend. Property values in the neighborhood have increased 15% since your stand against false claims, she reported. Buyers are specifically asking about security features and clear boundary enforcement. The morning's most surprising visitor was Linda Martinez. Richard and I found something you should see, she said, unfolding a yellowed newspaper from 20 years ago. The headline read, "Local activist opposes all development, claims entire township is sacred space." The article detailed Pat's earliest attempts to prevent any private property development. Tom Bennett's final investigative piece revealed the full scope of Pat's history. Over 15 years, she had attempted similar property grabs in 6 different neighborhoods, always using the same tactics: false historical claims, organized protests, and escalating demands for community access. Jennifer Chen monitored neighborhood social media as residents shared their relief. "The tension is gone," one neighbor wrote. "We can finally focus on real community building instead of manufactured outrage over imaginary traditions." Professor Matthews completed his historical research project. "The pattern is fascinating," he explained, spreading out maps and documents. She specifically targeted properties she had tried to purchase herself, creating false narratives about community use only after failing to acquire them privately. Dave reported a transformation in security system requests. "Your story has changed how people think about property rights," he said. They're not just buying security, they're making a statement about the importance of respecting boundaries. The afternoon brought a steady stream of neighbors stopping by to share their stories. Sarah Cooper revealed how Pat had tried to claim their backyard as a traditional community meditation space shortly after they moved in. Bob Thompson recalled her attempts to prevent any fencing in the neighborhood, citing imaginary historical preservation codes. Officer Rodriguez provided insight from law enforcement perspective. "We've updated our training protocols," she explained. "Your case is now used as an example of how organized harassment can masquerade as community activism." Richard Martinez called a final HOA meeting to address the situation. The board unanimously passed new regulations protecting homeowners' rights to secure their properties. "The Pat Miller era is over," he declared. "This community supports both private property rights and genuine neighborhood cooperation." Frank Peterson brought news of wider impact. Property owners in other communities were successfully challenging false historical claims using documentation from our case. The electric fence had become a symbol of standing up to organized harassment, disguised as community activism. Emily Watson shared an interesting development from City Hall. Urban planning students were now studying the case as an example of how false historical narratives can be used to attempt private property appropriation. The electric fence had sparked discussions about balancing security with genuine community needs. Diana Wright reported that 3 more properties in the neighborhood had installed security systems. "It's not just about protection," she explained. "It's about setting clear boundaries and expectations for respectful community interaction." The afternoon sun caught the warning signs on the electric fence, their message clear and unambiguous. What had started as a simple property dispute had exposed a pattern of behavior affecting multiple communities. The fence stood as a testament to the importance of standing firm against false claims and manufactured outrage. Tom Bennett's cameras captured Pat's final departure from the neighborhood. No ceremonies, no protests, no dramatic declarations about community spaces, just quiet acceptance that her tactics had finally met their match in documented truth and electrified boundaries. Jennifer Chen showed me the last posts from Pat's community activism groups. The once passionate supporters had drifted away, leaving only archived warnings about the consequences of false historical claims and organized harassment. As evening approached, neighbors gathered spontaneously in the street, not to protest, but to celebrate the return of genuine community spirit. Steve and Sarah Cooper brought out their grill. Bob and Nancy Thompson arrived with homemade pies. The conversation flowed naturally, without manufactured drama or false historical claims. The electric fence hummed quietly, its presence now a reassuring reminder that good neighborhoods are built on respect for boundaries, not false claims of community rights. The security lights cast a steady glow as children played safely in their own yards. Parents relaxed on their private porches, and genuine community bonds formed without the tension of manufactured outrage. Looking back, the fence had protected more than just property lines. It had preserved the truth about property rights and community responsibility. Pat's campaign of false claims had failed not just because of electric deterrence, but because reality eventually overcomes even the most elaborate deceptions. As night fell on Riverside Heights, the neighborhood had found a new balance. The electric fence stood as a symbol not of division, but of the clear boundaries that allow genuine communities to thrive. Sometimes the best way to build true connections is to first establish clear lines that everyone must respect. Up next on your screen, you've got 2 more standout stories. If you enjoyed this tale of standing up to false claims and manufactured outrage, you won't want to miss these. They're ready for you to discover right now. Just click and dive in.